Hello, this is Power in the Word, and I'm Scott Reed. Thanks for joining me for another one of the parables of Jesus as we look at today at the marriage of the king's son. This is one of his last parables he has going to give as he enters in his last week of life. So let's jump right in. As you can see, once again, we have to look at the background that lends itself to the parable and why this parable arises. And so the setting is very important. Though the parable starts in Matthew chapter 22, we've looked at Matthew 21 here in the heading. I would be sure to underline that Jesus has ridden into Jerusalem triumphantly, known as the triumphal entry on Sunday. He's going to go directly to the temple and cleanse it, cursing the fig tree, and he's been discussing why he has the authority to do what he does. In that context, he's given the parable of the two sons, you can see here in your heading, and he's given the parable of the wicked husbandman. What follows is chapter 22 and our parable today as you look at the parable of the marriage of the king's son. So this is a third parable right on top of each other, discussing why he has the right to do what he does. So let's jump into the parable of the king's son. I've given you a note here that maybe we change the name from the parable of the king's son to maybe the parable of the garment, since in the end, that's what really matters, is the wearing of a particular garment. So with that maybe suggestion, let's jump into verse 1 where it says, Jesus answers, spake unto them again by parables and said. Verse 2, the kingdom of heaven is like unto a certain king which made a marriage for his son. Remembering that parable means side-by-side comparison, our stories then starts with the kingdom of heaven. We have a note here from Joseph Fielding Smith in Answers to Gospel Questions, like most of the parables, that the kingdom of heaven is the church of Jesus Christ. So we understand that phrase, but it's being likened to a certain king. We're going to see that this certain king is a specific man, or a man known as a man of holiness, out of the book of Moses, or you call him God the Father. So this certain king, you'll note that it has to be God the Father because he's going to make a marriage for his son. Okay, there's a little note here. I would be sure to get 2a in your footnote. 2a down here says he's going to give a wedding celebration for his son. That wedding celebration is what you and I would call the marriage supper, or maybe you would call it a wedding breakfast after the marriage. If that's the case, then the marriage is the wedding celebration due to his son being married, and that idea in Jewish custom of his son being the bridegroom is found under Bible Dictionary, under marriage, and traditionally it is the place, the home of the bridegroom, where a marriage is actually to take place. Or we would suggest then the place of invitation to come to is the house of the Lord. Now, it shouldn't be anything new for you to look at the Son of God being a bridegroom and being married, that concept is all over scriptures. In fact, it's one of the most predominant concepts in the scriptural writ. Let me just throw up this slide here, and you can see some of the scriptural stories that contain this concept of a bride and a bridegroom. It is in our first story of our Bible, with Adam and Eve, using them as symbolic characters. It's in the middle story of our Bible. It's contained in the Christ genealogy and the 4 women mentioned there, and what their need is, because all of those women are they are deserving of a marriage, but they are not married and need a bridegroom. Hence, interesting chapter 1 of Matthew, where Jesus Christ then is born as the bridegroom for these 4 symbolic women. The very last story of the Bible, and we're going to take a look at it at the end of our parable today, is the supper of the bridegroom, found in Revelation 19 and 20. It's at the very chiastic center of our Old Testament story, known as Ruth and Boaz. And we see them acting out this bride and bridegroom scenario in Ruth chapters 1 through 4. It's also in our story in the book of Hosea, where Hosea is commanded by the Lord to marry Gomer. It's in the teachings of Isaiah in Isaiah's chapter 51 and 52. It's in the parable of the 10 virgins, which is on our playlist that you can look at. And as mentioned, it is in the entire book of Revelation as the winding up scene where the Son of Man, or you know him as Jesus Christ, then reveals himself at his second coming and is married to his church, or the bridegroom. Okay, so there are several stories in our text. Those are just the most prolific of the Son of God being married to the church as the bride and the bridegroom. Okay, so let's jump forward. We're in verse 3, and it says that the king here will send forth servants to call them that were bidden to the wedding. Now, these servants would be, even though we might at first note just call them prophets and apostles, there's a little bit more insight if we follow the entire parable through, and we'll do so. Notice in understanding the parables of Jesus Christ, both Donald and Jay Perry have mentioned that this first comment here in verse 3, the invitation of the feast, represents the prophets of the Old Testament issued to the people of the covenant, or you know them as Israel. So this first mentioned in verse 3 is Old Testament prophets. I would maybe write that in as an annotation. You're going to see them in verse 4, other prophets. That second invitation, those would be the prophets and apostles of the New Testament. And third, down in verses 9 and 10, we're going to see even more servants are invited to go out, and this third group of servants are known as the prophets of the restoration, or the prophets of this dispensation. So you have prophets mentioned several times, but different groups according to our parable. This first one, as mentioned, are sent to them that are bidden. We might call them the covenant people of Israel, with all their commandments and laws of the gospel. Okay, so here's the specific comment by Elder Talmage out of Jesus the Christ. Them that are bidden is covenant Israel, and it mentions that they did not want to come. Here is a great footnote in your footnotes. 3a down here says that they did not want to come, not that they would not come. Now, can you imagine being invited to a royal wedding of the king and queen's son, and in this case, you don't want to attend? Whoa, that brings on a whole new light. So it's not that they would not come, it's that they just don't want to attend. Our parable continues then and says, again, that's an important note, he's going to send out other servants. Remember, we've looked at these as New Testament prophets and apostles. That would include people like John the Baptist and others, saying, you tell them which were bidden. We called them covenant Israel. Behold, I have prepared my dinner. My oxen and my fatlings are killed, and all things are ready. Come unto the marriage. Now, sometimes if we look at this invitation and the preparations that are made, anybody that has been involved in preparing for a wedding, right now we in the Reed home are getting ready for one next month. Our littlest guy is being married, and the preparations are so many things to do and to have ready for that day. It wouldn't be any different here in our parable that Jesus is given, where lots of effort and cost and time and energy and thought have been put into this wedding dinner. Oxen, okay, and fatlings have been killed and are being prepared. Notice, and all things are ready. That denotes to come unto Christ. That's the dinner invitation. Come into a covenantal message or marriage and be involved in the gospel plan with all its doctrines and ordinances. So here's the invitation from the king to be linked with his son. But note, verse 5. This time, it's not that they didn't want to come, but, verse 5 says, they made light of it. Or the it there is the prophets or the servants that he sent. A great reminder to you might be what happens to those who make light of prophets and apostles out of 2 Kings 2:23 and 24. Remember where Elisha sends she-bears after those that have made fun or light of him according to the law of Moses, and he had those bears tear those youth up, okay, for making light of prophets. God will not tolerate that action. They stand as mouthpieces for him. So note this, these few comments from prophets and apostles concerning their message. The prophet, or the Paul Revere story that maybe you remember, the Paul Reveres in our lives may have voices too shrill, use bad grammar, ride a poor horse, and may pick the oddest hours to warn us. And it sounds like Paul Revere. But the test of warning is their accuracy, not their diplomacy. The disciples' commitment to truth must be to truth, without an inordinate concern for the method of delivery. You may not like the prophet. He may be old or funny looking. He may have a screechy voice. But that is not the concern. The concern is what the message, not the messenger, is. And so President Kimball has made further suggestion that we are to, notice, hearken to those we sustain as prophets and seers, as well as the other brethren, as if our eternal life depended upon it, because it does. So prophets and apostles have always been an important part as the mouthpieces of the Master, and you cannot separate prophets and apostles from Jesus Christ. They are one and the same. Okay? Whether they say something or whether he says something, it is the same, as Doctrine and Covenants 1 points out. Now, note, they said, verse 5, that they will make light of these prophets, and they went their ways, one to his farm and another to his merchandise. So they trample under their feet this message from the Master through his prophets and apostles. Note, there is, with them doing their own thing now and going about it in their own different ways, whatever that is, there may be an allusion here to one of the other parables that Jesus has already given out of Luke chapter 14, known as the parable of the Great Supper, where he gives insights on the excuses not to attend the marriage supper. And you can certainly go into my playlist and look for that parable. It's fantastic and has an unparalleled pattern as we look at the three excuses and the pride appetites and the riches subjects that they fall under. So, which are also the three temptations that Satan will throw at Christ. So that's a great allusion to putting an annotation back to the parable of the Great Supper. Now note then, verse 6 continues and Jesus says, and the remnant, or those that are left, take his servants, they entreat them spitefully, and they slay them. Okay, that's not going to make the king very happy as we look at the remnants being alluded to from Old Testament times. We know the 10 tribes have been lost already, but the residue or the remnant is the tribes of Judah and Benjamin mixed with a few other tribes, and their abusiveness with no respect but act out in violence against these servants can be noted here in Matthew 21, 35 and 36 as well, the parable of the wicked husbandman. So there's a great allusion to another parable, and God will not tolerate this. Okay, we see in 3 Nephi chapters 8 and 9 what happens to people that kill prophets. The Lord will not tolerate that, and he has them punished for doing so. In fact, that's the very reason that the Civil War of the United States occurs. Doctrine and Covenants 136, where the Lord says, they killed my prophets, meaning Joseph and Hiram Smith, and therefore they will suffer the wrath of God. So interesting that the Lord will not tolerate his prophets to be killed. So when the king, he says, heard thereof, or the slain of the prophets, he was wroth, and he sent forth his armies and destroyed those murderers and burned up their city. So in the case of our parable, notice the king is wroth and sends forth his armies is a very interesting insight. Okay? Notice the word wroth is Greek for enraged, and he sends forth, we know from history, the legions of Rome under the general Titus goes down and destroys Jerusalem in 70 through 72 AD as Jesus prophesies that this would happen, and destroys Jerusalem. We are left to ask ourselves, wait, is the Romans the king's army? If you put this little reference here of Doctrine and Covenants 117 verse 6, there's a marvelous little verse tucked away in modern Revelation. If we just go there real quick, you can see here from 117 of the Doctrine and Covenants verse 6, he says, "For have I, God, not the fowls of the heaven, and also the fish of the sea, and the beasts of the mountains? Have I not made the earth? Do I not hold the destinies of all the armies of the nations of the earth?" Who governs and influences those armies to do the bidding of the king? It's the king himself. They're his armies. So a great reference to come back here and tuck in to his armies in verse 7. And we see then that Jerusalem will be destroyed. Verse 8, as we continue in our parable, "So he then now will send forth other servants." As mentioned, these might be the servants you would call the latter-day prophets of the restoration. There's that quote in verse 3 that I gave you. "But they were also bidden, were not worthy to come." So Israel has made itself unworthy because they've killed the Son of God out of rejection and open rebellion against prophets and apostles. That's called apostasy, where they are rising up against the leaders of the church in the late New Testament era, and therefore are not worthy of coming in and being tied to Christ. So the invitation now from these servants is, the king says, "Go ye therefore then into the highways, and as many as you shall find, bid to this wedding." Okay? Now, if we look at the word highway here, that might suggest a couple of things. Notice highways would be a little further out than the city. So they represent of those far areas beyond the boundaries of the covenant, you know, as covenant Israel or Jerusalem, and you're going now out to the heathens or the pagan nations, as Elder Talmage has mentioned. Okay, you're inviting all, which is fascinating because we know that ability to ask all to come in to be a part of Christ originally was not given to Gentiles. But in Acts chapter 10, Peter receives a revelation that they might too be involved in the gospel of Jesus Christ and been given that opportunity. So here they are, as mentioned, going out a little bit further into the lands and bidding all to come be a part of the house of God, being the place of the marriage. Remember? Okay, so the parable continues now in verse 10, where he says, "So the servants did go out to the highways, and they began to gather." That's a huge, important word. We know it's the verse that denotes the gathering of the last days. "Together, all, as many as are found." We invite all to come be a part of us, both bad and good. And so this parable, like the parable of the net in Matthew 13:47 through 51, where all kinds of fishes are gathered in, both the good and the bad, and invited to come unto Christ and be tied with him. Well, note, the marriage is finally furnished with its guests. There is enough now to hold this wedding feast. So, verse 11 says, "When the king now comes in to see the guests." So, here's the wedding supper. The king makes his appearance, and he sees out in the audience a man, specific person, which had not on a wedding garment. Okay, so stop. We have to do some discussion here, as we've brought people in, remember, from the highways in verse 9. That would have meant that these people would not have been able to go back home and dress and clean themselves in appropriate clothing for a royal wedding. They wouldn't have had that opportunity and that time. So bringing them in straight from the highways and gathering them together for the wedding, they would have been furnished, notice, with specific clothing, and requested by the king to be wearing that clothing when the wedding occurs. So they've had all things furnished and ample time to change. So note, when the king comes out to see the guests, I've noted it is clear that the king is considering the guests one by one, rather than simply as a group. We are not saved as a congregations or groups, but as individuals who have come unto Christ and receiving his grace and have done the works required for us. So one had not had on a wedding garment as he comes down the line. Notice the word "he had not on." See this word right here? I would be sure that you darken it. Let's put a little bit more color on it for you so you can see it. There we go. Okay, this word "on" in the Greek is the word "enduo," or it's the English word we use for endow or endowment. So he has not been endowed and has not got on an appropriate garment. Yeah, see, that's great insight if you remember that this is where the marriage takes place, is in the house of the Lord. Okay, that should have been done. Initiatory. Now, common knowledge, as I mentioned earlier, is that one must be dressed properly when seeking audience with the king. Being brought in from the highways would not have allowed time and means to prepare to meet the king, so that one has been provided with appropriate attire to clothe themselves is come out of the king's wardrobe himself. In other words, these people wear royal clothing. I love this comment here. A great quote from Kistemaker, who said, "The guest who did not have wedding clothes at the royal banquet unmistakably represents the self-righteous sinner. He wants to make it known that he does not need the sacrificial death and atoning blood of Jesus to enter heaven. It is an utter impossibility to appear before God without the protective clothing of Jesus Christ." So even one not of the Latter-day Restoration points out that he sees this clothing as absolutely necessary, and the clothing would be with linked to Jesus Christ, since it is his clothing and royal clothing that we wear, and should not only wear thoughtfully but treat appropriately those garments. So here's the king. He's finally come in, notice, and he says, seeing this man not having his garment on, an act of willful rebellion, he says unto him, "Friend, how comest thou in hither, not having a wedding garment?" And he was speechless. Now, we would be quick indeed to think that the king father was calling this man friend as a warm greeting. That is not the case. The original Greek for the word friend is not warm at all. It is a term indicating that the man has been insolent or disrespectful to the king and his son in not wearing the required clothing. So note that, what does this man even say? He is speechless. Now, let me give you maybe a different slant on that. If you come into the house of the Lord and think you can enter into the king's kingdom and not wear garments, then certainly you have not paid the price to have come in and learn of him and know what to say at certain places. So notice, to say he was speechless may have an allusion to he does not know what to say at the gate or the veil to enter in. It is unknown to him. He's indeed speechless. So then the king says to his servants, "Bind him hand and foot, and take him away, and cast him into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth." Now remember that the requirements to outer darkness is given by Latter-day Revelation. A great quote in Doctrine and Covenants 76 verse 31 might be this verse that teaches us that to be cast out to outer darkness, an individual had to have been at least a member of the church, to hold priesthood, and third, to be involved in the higher ordinances in the king's kingdom. So to be cast out to outer darkness does suggest that this person is indeed a member and has knowledge and understanding on what should have taken place. Therefore, he is in the act of open rebellion against the king and his son. And then Jesus finishes our parable by saying, "For many are called, but few are chosen." Now, that's a great way to end our note, understanding here that from modern day revelation, we know what that means. Great cross-reference would be Doctrine and Covenants 121, verse 34, and one to our own Bible, Revelation 19, 7 through 9. So let's look at those as we close. Him claiming that, many are called, but few are chosen. And great footnote, I forgot to tell you, there's a great footnote here. They are not chosen, wherefore all do not have on the wedding garment. So good JST change for us. Notice, what does that wedding garment then, or being chosen, denote? When we look at Doctrine and Covenants 121, verse 34, it says, there are many called, but few are chosen. And why are not they chosen? And he then gives a lot of verses on what being chosen looks like. However, I would just maybe encourage you to write this comment down by Elder Packer out of the Ensign or Conference Report, November 1980. He says, your authority comes through your ordination. So many are called and given the authority by way of hands laid on their head in an ordination. However, your power or being chosen comes through obedience and worthiness, which we see that this man did not. He may have had membership and had ordinances, but he had no power or chosen because he was not worthy and had not been obedient, thus experiencing the power within the gospel covenant. Now, if we just quickly go over to Revelation 19 to close, here in John's Revelation, we see the verses starting in verse 7, let us be glad and rejoice and give honor to him, for the marriage of the Lamb, that's been our parable, he is come, and his wife, the church, has made herself ready. So there's this, once again, this bride-bridegroom concept. And verse 8, and to her, the wife or the church, was granted that she should be arrayed in fine linen, clean and white, or you would call it, she's been endowed and been given proper garment. For her fine linen symbolically suggests then what this garment represents is the righteousness of the saints. And see, he would not put on the righteousness. Our man was cast out to outer darkness because he thought he could do it alone without the lamb's clothing, which was symbolic worthiness or power or righteousness and obedience. And John concludes, and he said unto me, you write this down, blessed are they which are called unto the marriage supper of the Lamb. And he saith unto me, these are the true sayings of God. So we're left as we conclude our parable with this marvelous idea of being prepared without excuse in our obedience and in the clothed in the grace and ordinances of the gospel of Jesus Christ, so that we might be ready to be invited to be tied to him on the millennial day. There's a great then parable and the conclusion that those husbandmen in Matthew chapter 22 are not acting under authority, though they may have been called. They were not chosen, and hence they will not be provided with garments and with the marriage of the supper of the Lamb. Well, great insights for us in our latter-day understanding. May you and I continue to be arrayed or endowed with cleanliness and obedience and righteousness, and be prepared to obtain the grace of the Lamb at his marriage or millennial day. Thanks for staying tuned with me. Hope that this has helped you understand one of the great parables and the power that comes with them as we look at their details in a little bit more depth than usual. And hope you go in and look at those other parables under our playlist, that you might do some studying in them. Till the next time.